Good morning. As always, we're happy for our visitors today. We have several. We have family members who are here. It's special in many ways. Bob and Shirley Brown are back this morning. We've missed them for quite some time. And Bob looks no worse for wear, but what a treat to have both of them this morning. And all of you. Okay, hope everybody's well. All right, we'll be in Acts chapter 20 this morning, and the text has been read. That's familiar to us. I want us to kind of put it into perspective here as we think about some things that are probably the most well-known regarding this particular reading. But Paul and his company of evangelists and fellow travelers make their way to Troas, and Troas is a little town that is situated on the western shore of what was then known as Asia Minor, and today is known as Turkey. But Paul and his preaching companions, which include Sopater in verse 4 of Berea, Aristarchus, Secundus, Gaius, Timothy, Tychicus, Trophimus, and Luke is in the company because Luke is describing all that we will think about this morning, having written the book of Acts himself. And these men going ahead waited for us at Troas. So they preceded Paul, Luke, in their trip to Troas. We sailed from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days joined them at Troas, where we stayed 7 days. So the suggestion is that after arriving at Troas, then they waited for a week, 7 days, and on the next day, then, they assembled with the congregation of the little town of Troas, and that's where we begin our reading in verse 7. And in verse 7, on the first day of the week, just like today, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message, his sermon, his talk until midnight. Now, of all the interesting things that stand out in this reading, we are introduced to one member of this congregation. And I have to step back a little bit as I read this and as I think about it with you this morning. Because in all the years that I have read this text, for whatever reason, I have never stopped to think about the fact that Eutychus was a member of the church that met at Troas. I've read so many things, I've heard so many things about Troas, and we all laugh, and we have our jokes about long-winded preachers and stuffy sermons and how we can't stay awake during the entire process And Eutychus is the one that comes to mind as the biblical precedent for our inability to keep our eyes open while the preacher is up here preaching his heart out. And that's what we think about. But for some reason, it never really dawned on me that in our view of the church at Troas, meeting on the first day of the week, just like we are now, we're getting a view of how they worshiped and what they did. And I don't know of any other passage in the New Testament that tells us more about a worship assembly than this one does. So there's fellowship here. Brethren are together. They're breaking bread. And some will argue with you over whether that means a common meal or the Lord's Supper. I'm going to take it as the Lord's Supper, in keeping with what Jesus taught should be done to remember His body and His blood, just as we've done. That's what these brethren were doing. There was preaching. Here was the Apostle Paul. He was in company with many other preachers. They were traveling. They were in this august assembly of brethren, congregation that meets in Troas. And somewhat similar to Paul's experience when going to synagogues among the Jews, if you were recognized as a teacher in a synagogue setting, well, quite commonly, you were asked to speak if you wanted to. They just gave you the floor. And that may be what happened here. Paul was in the congregation. They may well have asked him, Paul, you want to preach? Today's your day. And I've never known a preacher to say no at an invitation like that. So here's preaching. Now, with other passages, you have giving that takes place, and Mike read already from 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and there he is. 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2. You have singing, Ephesians 5:19. Other passages that fill in what we're not told here. But here's the congregation at Troas, and we're introduced to one member of that church. And believe it or not, this text has some pretty interesting things to say about him. Some very positive things. We're going to draw some lessons from it, I hope, this morning, as we think about it. So here's a member in verse 9. We know him by the name of Eutychus. All right? So our focus is on him. Now, the focus should equally be upon Paul, because of what happens with regard to Eutychus and bringing him back from the dead. And the situation is this, that they were on a third floor of some building somewhere where the congregation met. A high rise in that day and time, I guess. And the room was full of lamps, and there were many lamps burning, Luke tells us. And in verse 8, and you can just imagine, if you're in a room somewhere, and maybe there's one or two windows or whatever, and people have lamps going because it's at night and they need to see, then you can just imagine that the room might kind of fill up with smoke a little bit. And the atmosphere is a little bit soporific. And Eutychus, because it's so crowded, takes a window seat. And after a while, he begins to nod and he begins to blink. And he can hardly keep his eyes open. And he can no longer hear Paul preaching, and he drifts off into a sound sleep. And before you know it, he falls out of the window. 3 stories to his death. And everybody rushes out down to Eutychus. People are crying, "Oh no, what's happened?" And they go down and they surround him, and Paul lays himself on top of Eutychus, just like Elijah did back in 1 Kings chapter 17, and just like Elisha did in 2 Kings chapter 4, in similar instances. And the Apostle Paul, by the power of God that resided in him, becomes one of few people in the world, 5 by my count, that ever brought another human being back from the dead. And what's amazing about all of that, that's not amazing enough. It is. But after all of that, they go back upstairs and they go back to church. And Paul keeps on preaching, speaking to them. The text says he spoke to them. I cannot imagine that there wasn't some of that preaching fire in his voice. And Eutychus was back in the company. And Paul continued to preach until daybreak. Now, we remember Paul preaching till midnight, and all of this occurring at the midnight hour. But they all went back to the assembly. Paul preached all night long until daybreak because he had to leave after that. Now, how's that for a church service? These people were not under time constraints. They said, "Paul is here, we're going to let him preach. Here's an opportunity." And Eutychus fell asleep under the preaching of Paul. So I don't think too badly of anybody else that does so in my case. And then he preached until daybreak, all night long. Now, if you can imagine Eutychus falling out of that window to his death, how's that for a disruption to a church service? I mean, you wouldn't expect anything like that to happen. These people didn't expect that to happen. And yet, of all the things that occurred here, what can we learn from it? Let's think about a few things here. Number one, and I address this question to you. How will you be remembered? And you know what I'm alluding to here. We remember Eutychus as the guy who went to sleep at church and fell out of the window. And that's about all we remember. We don't remember anything else about him. We don't remember that here was a very fine young man by all implications. Luke calls him young. We'll address that in a moment. But I would suggest to you that here was a very fine, exemplary young man in the worship assembly. We don't remember that. We don't remember that here was a faithful Christian. Here was a disciple of Jesus. We don't even remember, usually, that here was somebody who was brought back from the dead. All we can remember is he fell asleep at church. And he fell out of the window. And there's even a VBS song about him. I don't know the song. I think we used to sing it. But he's famous on that count, and that's what people remember. Now, what will people remember about you? In Hebrews 11 and verse 4, Cain offered a better sacrifice than his brother Abel. And God testified by that. And through it, or by it, he, that is Abel, offering a better sacrifice than Cain, I may have gotten a switch, is remembered to this day. It speaks to his effect. That's what we know. He, being dead, still speaks. Okay? How will you be remembered? What is it about you that people will hang on to long after you're gone? Will it be something negative? Will it be the fact that you were never happy in life? Or will it be something positive, that you're the most loving person that I've ever known in this world? That you are faithful to Jesus, that you love the Lord, that you could never miss an opportunity to be with the saints. What will people remember about you? Believe me, you are writing your own autobiography, as it were, and people will remember something about you. You have the opportunity now to frame whatever that is that people will keep in their memory about you. That's what we have here with Eutychus, you see. So that's something we can learn from this. A second thing that we can learn from this, and I've already mentioned it, is that Eutychus was a young man. And I take that as an indication that he pursued spiritual things while young in life. Luke tells us that he was a young man named Eutychus. Well, all right, how young? I don't know. Was he in his teenage years? Maybe. Was he in his early 20s? Maybe. I don't know. But here was a young man. Were there gray heads around him in the assembly? Probably so. But here was a young man at church. Did he have anybody with him? I don't know. Did he have a wife? Family? I don't know. He was there. And he is an example of Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 2. Remember God in the days of your youth, before the hard times come and the days draw nigh, when you say, I have no pleasure in them, I don't care anymore. Before all of that happens, remember God while you're young. So here's Eutychus. He's doing that. And what's impressive to me is that he's in the assembly with the brethren on the first day of the week. He has observed the Lord's Supper in memory of the body and the blood of Jesus. He's listening to the greatest apostle preach. He's all tucked up in a window. And he could have had any number of reasons not to be there. And yet he was. Now, think about some of his reasons that he might have employed so as not to have showed up that night and been where he was. He might have said, you know what? I'm a slave. We don't know anything about Eutychus particularly. There were a great many slaves in that society, and slaves had to work during the day. And if they were to go anywhere, it had to be at night. It could have been that Eutychus was a slave. He had to work all day. But he showed up for worship service at night on the Lord's Day. He could have said, you know what? I'm tired. I've worked all day long. I've got to go home. He didn't do that, did he? Eutychus could have said, you know, I know how these preachers are. They're long-winded. I just don't have the time. Can't spend my time sitting up there listening to some long-winded preacher. He didn't say that I'm aware of. Eutychus could have had a medical condition. It's possible that he had to take some sort of medication. He sat in that window and that medicine went to work on him. And he started listening with his eyes closed, as I hear people say. Before that, before you know it, he falls out of the window. Eutychus could have said, you know, I've got a medical condition. If I go and listen to sermon Sunday, I'll fall asleep in the middle of it. He didn't say that. He could have said, you know, I'm just not a night person. These nighttime assemblies like this, he doesn't know that Paul is going to preach till midnight and beyond that. He could have said, I'm just not a night person. If this thing were in the morning, that'd be okay. But not at night. I can't do that. So here are all the things that he could have said, but he didn't say, that I'm aware of. And here is a young man who is driven by faith in Jesus and love for the Lord, and he's with God's people on the Lord's Day. Well, we can take a lesson from that. And I would think that would mean something to us. And here's the third thing that we might learn from this. And that is the power of restoration in terms of Eutychus. The power of restoration. That means his life was restored to him. Paul went down with the others. Paul bent down over him. And by the power of God through an apostle, Paul said, don't worry, his life is still in him. And they got up and they went back to worship. And from what I can tell, Eutychus did too. And Paul kept on speaking. Imagine what had just happened and all the questions that people might have had. Why did God allow this to happen? And Paul had to address things like that perhaps. I don't know. But anyway, the excitement continued all night long. Paul kept on speaking, preaching, if you will, until daybreak. And then they took Eutychus home. And they were no little encouraged by all of that. No, it's interesting the way Luke worded that, isn't it? No little. That means they were greatly encouraged by it. And there's a lesson in his restoration here. When you think of Eutychus, what do you think of? You think of a guy who fell asleep in church. That's his legacy. That's sad. Because his real legacy should be, he was a faithful Christian. He was a disciple of Jesus. He worshiped with the saints on the Lord's Day. He was young. He loved the Lord while he was a young man. And his restoration to life instilled His Spirit to remain faithful to the Lord, hopefully all of his life, you see. So maybe we can learn something from that. Think about it. The power of a restoration. I would like to think that every time you come to an assembly such as this, there's a restoration that occurs, a restoration in your heart, in your will, a resolve to continue to do better, to be more faithful, more loving, more serving. There's a power in restoration. Sometimes there are people who come and they're burdened with problems. Something weighing really heavy on their mind. And there's a sin that just won't let go of them, and they can't let go of it until they are forgiven of it and restored. There's a restoration. And what a joy it is anytime in an assembly such as this, when we watch one person obey the gospel of Jesus. And we don't see it with the eye, but here's what happens. That person dies. They die to their sins. They are buried. In water and baptism, they are raised. As Eutychus was raised, they're raised to a new life in Christ, being forgiven of their sins by the blood of Jesus. That's a restoration. That's a delight to our hearts. And that's what causes angels to rejoice. Think about the legacy of Eutychus. Just think about it. And it's a lot more than some guy that sat down on a window, fell asleep, and died from a fall because the preacher preached too long. A lot more to it than that. Contemplate these things, and how will you be remembered? It's your time now to act on that while we stand and while we sing to encourage you.